The first time she told him she was too broken to love. The wind was howling like a pack of wolves across the high desert, and the sun was sinking red behind the jagged cliffs, bleeding color over the wide and merciless land. He was standing outside the saloon with his hat tipped low, boots caked in trail dust, a revolver resting easy on his hip, the kind of man folks whispered about when the lamps burned low. She stood in the doorway with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, eyes colder than the steel at his side, and when she said those words, they came out steady, sharp, and final, like the crack of a rifle across canyon stone. Her name was Clara Whitfield, though most in the town of Red Hollow called her Widow Whitfield. Even though she had never worn a wedding ring, she carried loss the way some women carried perfume. Strong, constant, impossible to ignore. Her father had been gunned down over a cattle dispute. Her brother vanished on a gold trail that swallowed men whole. And the ranch that once stood proud on the eastern ridge had burned to ash under a sky that never bothered to rain. She stayed, though stubborn as mesquite roots, running the last stretch of land with 2 hired hands and a shotgun that had seen more truth than most men. He rode into Red Hollow 3 days before that sunset, a stranger on a coal-black stallion with a scar running from his jaw to his collarbone. He gave his name as Jonah Creed, and that was all. No stories, no explanations. Just a nod at the stable boy and a silver coin tossed without counting. Folks noticed the way he walked, slow and balanced, like a man who had measured death and found it wanting. The sheriff watched him from across the street, hand resting on his badge, but Jonah did nothing wrong. He drank 1 whiskey, paid for it, and stepped back into the dust, as if the town itself were just another temporary stop on a long and private road. Clara first saw him when her wagon wheel snapped near the creek bend. 1 mile out from town, the sun was merciless that afternoon, pressing down on her shoulders like judgment. She fought the wheel with clenched teeth and stubborn pride, refusing to curse, refusing to cry. It was Jonah who rode up without a word, dismounted smooth as shadow, and knelt beside the broken axle. His hands were rough, steady, and sure, and though he never asked permission, he fixed the wheel as if it were a duty he had been born to fulfill. When she tried to thank him, he only shrugged and said, "A wheel ain't meant to stay broken, ma'am, unless someone leaves it that way." That was how it began, not with flowers or sweet talk, but with wood shavings in the dirt and sweat darkening a man's collar. Clara did not smile at him, not then, but she did not turn away either. She watched him the way a wary horse watches an open gate, wanting freedom but fearing the whip. Jonah climbed back onto his stallion and tipped his hat once before riding off toward town, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the one she had grown used to. It wasn't the silence of loss, it was the silence of something waiting. Jonah began showing up at the edge of her property after that, never crossing the fence line without invitation, sometimes bringing nails, sometimes feed for the horses, sometimes nothing at all but his quiet presence. He would lean against the post and speak of ordinary things, the weather turning, cattle prices dropping, rumors of rustlers moving north. Clara answered in short replies, keeping her distance as if words themselves might betray her. Yet there was something in the way he looked at the land, at the burned remains of her old barn, that told her he understood what it meant to lose more than wood and nails one evening, as a storm brewed heavy in the west. She finally asked him why he kept coming around. He did not look surprised by the question, just rested his forearms on the fence rail and stared at the horizon. "I've seen what happens when a place gets left alone too long," he said quietly. "It forgets it was ever meant for living." Clara felt something twist inside her chest, sharp and unwelcome. She told him then, plain and unvarnished, "I ain't some ranch that needs fixing, Mr. Creed. I'm too broken to love, and I ain't asking to be repaired." The thunder rolled low across the valley, shaking the windows of her small ranch house, and Jonah stepped closer to the fence, not crossing it, but near enough that she could see the honesty in his eyes. "That's why I chose you," he said, voice steady as iron rails. "Not in spite of it, Clara, but because of it. Broken things ain't weak, they've just survived more than most." The rain finally came then, sudden and fierce, soaking them both where they stood, but neither moved, neither looked away. And in that storm, under a sky that had once refused her mercy, something began to shift, not whole, not healed, but alive, like the first green shoot pushing up through scorched earth. The rain that night did more than soak the dust out of Red Hollow. It stirred up ghosts that had been sleeping beneath the surface of things. By morning the creek was running high and brown, and Clara stood on her porch watching the swollen water rush past like time she could not hold. Jonah rode in just after sunrise, hat brim dripping, coat dark with rain. He didn't call out, didn't wave, just tied his stallion to the rail and walked up the steps like a man who had already decided he belonged there. Clara felt the old instinct to push him away rise sharp in her chest, but she let him stand beside her instead, their shoulders nearly touching, both staring at the restless land. News travels fast in small towns, faster than fire in dry grass. By noon the sheriff had ridden out to her place with worry carved deep in his brow. A band of riders had been spotted west of the ridge, men carrying rifles and wearing red sashes around their arms, the mark of Calder Boone's outfit. Boone was a name spoken low and careful, a cattle baron turned outlaw who believed every unguarded acre was an invitation. Clara's land bordered the open range. An open range meant opportunity to men like him. Jonah listened without interrupting, eyes steady, jaws set. Clara crossed her arms and told the sheriff she had handled worse than rumors, but that night the horses grew restless, stamping and snorting in the dark. Clara stepped outside with her shotgun cradled against her hip, the moon hanging thin and sharp above the ridge. She saw them then, shadows moving where shadows ought not move, riders outlined against silver light, counting fences, measuring distance. Jonah appeared beside her without a sound, revolver already in hand. He did not ask what she wanted to do, he simply waited, giving her the choice that most men would have stolen. She felt a strange strength in that. Knowing he would stand but not command, they did not fire that night. The riders turned back after a long, silent survey, but the message had been left clear as boot prints in mud. Clara did not sleep. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table cleaning the shotgun piece by piece. Jonah across from her doing the same with his revolver, the lamplight painting gold across scarred knuckles and tired eyes. "You don't have to fight this with me," she said at last, voice low. "I've been fighting alone a long time." Jonah looked up, and there was no pity in his gaze, only truth. "I ain't here because you can't stand alone, Clara. I'm here because no one should have to." The next morning Jonah rode into town to gather supplies, and whispers followed him like stray dogs. Some said he had once ridden with Boone's kind, others claimed he had hunted them. No one knew for certain. The bartender leaned close and muttered that Boone himself had asked about a scarred man on a black horse. Jonah gave no reaction, only finished his drink and stepped back into the sun. When he returned to the ranch, he carried more than bullets and rope. He carried the knowledge that this was no random threat. It was personal, and it was coming. Clara met him in the yard, sleeves rolled, hair tied back tight. She had the look of a woman who had buried too much to fear one more grave. He told her what he had heard, about Boone asking questions, about old grudges that might not be hers but were fast becoming so. For a long moment she said nothing, then she laughed once, bitter and dry. "Seems trouble follows you like a hound, Mr. Creed." He did not deny it. "I used to ride with men who thought taking was easier than building," he admitted. "I left when I learned they were wrong. Boone don't forgive men who walk away." The confession hung between them heavier than the coming heat. Clara felt the sharp sting of betrayal rise up, not because of what he had been, but because of what it might cost her now. "You should go," she said, each word measured. "If he wants you, don't let my land be the place he finds you." Jonah stepped closer, close enough that she could see the regret etched into the lines of his face. "I won't run again," he said quietly. "I ran from who I was once, and it nearly hollowed me out. I won't run from who I'm trying to be." By dusk the riders returned, this time not as shadows but as a line of armed men cresting the ridge, red sashes bright against dust and stone. Boone himself rode at the front, tall and broad-shouldered, a cruel smile beneath a trimmed beard. He called out across the distance, offering Clara protection in exchange for her land, offering Jonah forgiveness in exchange for his loyalty. Clara lifted her shotgun and rested it easy against the fence rail. Jonah stood beside her, revolver low but ready. She did not look at him when she spoke, but her voice carried clear across the yard. "I told you I was too broken to love, Jonah." The wind caught her hair as she added, "If you stand here now, you stand, knowing this fight might finish what's left of me." Jonah's answer came without hesitation. "Then I'll stand anyway, because broken or whole, you're worth the trouble." And as Boone's men began to spread out like wolves, circling prey, the first shot split the evening wide open, and there was no turning back. The first shot cracked through the valley like the sky itself had split, and after that there was no more talking, only the hard language of gunfire and dust. Boone's men fanned out across the ridge, rifles flashing in the dying light. Clara fired from behind the fence rail, steady and unflinching, while Jonah moved like a man born to chaos. Low and precise, each bullet chosen careful as a promise. The horses screamed in their pens, the air thick with smoke and the bitter scent of powder. Boone shouted orders from horseback, his voice sharp with anger and something close to desperation. Jonah reached Clara between volleys, pulling her down as splinters burst from the porch post where her head had been a breath before. "You fall back to the barn," he ordered, but she shook him off, eyes blazing hotter than the firelight. "This is my land," she shot back. "I won't hide from it." He saw then that loving her did not mean shielding her from the fight. It meant fighting beside her in it. They moved together toward the old, burned frame of the barn, using the charred beams for cover, firing in rhythm. 2 heartbeats set against a storm of lead. Boone himself rode closer, reckless with fury, revolver raised high as if daring fate to challenge him. He called out to Jonah, voice cutting through the smoke. "You always were soft, Creed, choosing dirt and fences over power. You think this woman will mend what's rotten in you." Jonah stepped from cover before Clara could stop him, boots planting firm in the dirt. "I don't need mending, Boone," he answered. "I need a reason." Boone laughed and fired, the shot grazing Jonah's shoulder and spinning him half around. Clara's scream tore free before she could stop it. Pain burned through Jonah's arm, but he did not fall. He steadied himself, lifted his revolver with his uninjured hand, and fired once, clean and true. Boone jerked in the saddle, surprise flashing across his face before he slid from the horse and hit the ground heavy and final. The remaining riders faltered, their courage tied too tight to the man who now lay bleeding into Clara's dust. One by one they broke, spurring their mounts and fleeing toward the ridge, leaving only drifting smoke and the long echo of what they had started. Silence returned, slow and uncertain. Like a stray dog unsure of welcome, Clara dropped her shotgun and ran to Jonah's side, her hands trembling as she pressed cloth against his wound. The blood was dark, but not pouring. The bullet had carved a line rather than claimed a life. "You stubborn fool," she whispered, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. He managed a crooked smile despite the pain. "Guess I've been called worse." The sheriff and a handful of townsmen arrived not long after, drawn by the thunder of gunfire. They took in the scene, Boone's body, the scattered shells, the 2 figures standing shoulder to shoulder amid ruin. In the days that followed, Red Hollow changed its tune about Jonah Creed. The whispers softened, suspicion giving way to something close to respect. He healed slow but steady in Clara's small ranch house, sitting at her table with his arm bound tight, while she moved through the rooms with a quiet intensity that had nothing to do with fear anymore. The burned barn began to rise again under their combined labor, new beams replacing blackened ones, fresh nails biting into solid wood. Each strike of the hammer sounded less like repair and more like defiance. One evening, as the sun dipped gold across the rebuilt frame, Clara set her tools aside and faced him in the open yard. The wind tugged at her hair, but her voice did not shake. "I meant what I said," she began. "I am broken in ways that won't smooth out easy. I wake some nights hearing gunshots that ain't there. I look at you and see every man I've buried." Jonah stepped closer, careful with his healing arm but certain in his stance. "I don't need you unbroken, Clara," he said softly. "I chose you because you know what loss costs, because you stayed when most would have run. Love ain't about finding something perfect. It's about building something honest." She studied him a long moment, searching for doubt, for fear, for the flicker of regret that had chased other men from her life. She found none, only a steady warmth that felt less like fire and more like sunrise. Slow and certain, Clara reached for his uninjured hand and held it tight, not as a promise of forever, not as a surrender of scars, but as a choice made clear in daylight. The land around them still bore marks of battle, bullet scars in wood, churned earth where horses had torn through grass, yet above it all the sky stretched wide and open, and for the first time in years she did not feel alone beneath it. She had warned him she was too broken to love, and he had chosen her anyway, and in that choosing they found not perfection, but something stronger, a love forged in dust, tested by fire, and stubborn enough to endure whatever storms might ride over the ridge next.